Okay, so I want to
Yeah.
propose a different thing. I don't think that Jim Carrey, I don't know about Andy Kaufman, but I don't think that what Jim Carrey is proposing or the kind of perspective that I like to take a lot is the same thing as nihilism. For me personally, this more creation perspective is the way through nihilism because like God is dead. The at least for me, I am not able to believe in a rigid moral structure being absolute truth because I think it's disprovable, at least to me. And so I struggled with that for a long time. Like, is everything meaningless? And then there's a way to get to the other side of that of, okay, maybe in one sense we could say it's meaningless, but in the other sense we could frame it as potential. Everything is potential and it's potential for good. And it's not just nobody else exists. It's and none of this really matters. It's like we're living in a grand universe where maybe none of us matter to the grand scheme. Maybe we do, it's possible, but in this perspective, none of us matter to the grand scheme, but it's something that has a lot of potential because it all matters to each of us and we can create something beautiful out of it. And I think that's very distinct from nihilism. And I don't think that we should be lumping them together just because it goes through nihilism to get there. I think it's the solution to nihilism. I don't think that you're going to be able to send society back into a religious way of thinking because I don't know. I don't think it's going to work. I don't think people are going to buy that anymore. I think that human knowledge has gotten to a point where these kinds of rigid structures aren't going to hold. But maybe this new agey, quasi-Buddhist, whatever Jim Carrey philosophy could develop into something beautiful that could bring us forward.
I mean, I'm going to say I also feel that you're mischaracterizing what I'm saying, kind of. I'm not arguing for a return to like rigid religious fundamentalism, but I would ask you to clarify a little bit more, like, what is this solution that you're putting forward, this like Buddhist potential focused solution to nihilism?
Basically, okay, so yeah, sorry, I know you're not a religious fundamentalist, but basically the idea of having like objective morality. I would say that, well, it's still developing.
Yeah, so the nihilism, sometimes you might call this the dark night of the soul. So this is when someone enters the level of despair and they realize, hey, everything is meaningless. Like, what am I doing here? As some people call this existentialist dread. And then when you go through that for a while, hopefully you get past it and you get to the other side and you see that actually things can be given meaning, and we all have that power, or we have the power to set our own goals and create something or look for meaning in different ways. And this is the point, like this is the ideal or the sublimation which saying that Carey and Kaufman have hinted at, that we can create something beautiful. And it doesn't, I've never seen anyone who has realized that everything is essentially meaningless and then gone on to realize that everything can be as meaningful as you want it to be, and then said, let's go stab people. That's not really, that doesn't comply with my experience. I don't know if
I mean, that is exactly what psychopaths do. Like, I'm sorry, but that is exactly what psychopathy and sociopathy is. And I mean, I'm totally acknowledging that there's this other side of it that's beautiful and positive, but yeah, it's saying that nothing matters and I can create whatever meaning I want to. And so I'm going to lie and cheat and whatever. And, you know, I'm going to do me. And
So some people do go that way when they have these realizations. But I think that a lot of the reason for that is because, okay, maybe these realizations are kind of we could see them as the shadow self or part of the shadow self of our society. Like, we don't want to acknowledge that, oh, fuck, we're like on a rock floating through space and it's all kind of meaningless and what the heck are we doing? So when people struggle with that, they're kind of alone. I don't think that having that point of view and that perspective that things are inherently meaningless or that we need to create our own meaning is the problem. I think that the problem is that when people are questioning that, they're alone, or there's something in them that makes them then go, okay, so the meaning that I want to create is destruction. Like psychopaths are going through that, but the problem is that there's something base within them that says, I can do whatever I want, so I want to hurt people and destroy. And I don't think that that's where a healthy human being would be. And I think that most people, if they went through this, and especially if this is something that our society acknowledged, could go through it and could be guided or would go to a much more beautiful place with it. And I think maybe a lot of the problems of our society today are because of nihilism, but maybe it's because we're all in that existential crisis phase, you know?
I tend to think it's more like a phase. Like what you're saying, like, I don't think there's any argument you can make that's provable or self-evident that everything is meaningless and there's no higher meaning. And it's just as much an assumption as saying that there's a Christian God who's looking down on us, and it just happens to be the trend of the time that's maybe not the trend of the time, but it's the stage of the dialectic that we're at. But that's what people tend to believe right now.
That's the point. Like it's a personal experience. So it doesn't necessarily matter if it's the ultimate truth of things, but it is something that a lot of people go through.
It's not a personal experience. I would argue it's a historical experience. Like I would argue that
it might be a historical experience, but it's absolutely a personal experience.
I would argue that what you guys are describing is something very similar to like the Nietzschean perspective. You're basically saying like, God is dead, and so we're going to create our own meaning and a triumph of the will and all this stuff. You know, even though you guys are framing it differently and you're going through a Buddhist perspective, like ultimately it is kind of an Ubermensch perspective. And I guess what I'm kind of arguing for is more like a Jungian perspective, because Jung was like responding to Nietzsche, and he was saying like, actually there's all these pitfalls when you try to create your own personal morality, your own personal meaning. And if you're going to do that, what you really need to do is you actually do have to go back to the past and go back to meaning and go back to things that are ancient.
So I just want to break in and just say a couple of things. The first thing is, so clearly, as Kurt was saying, most people probably wouldn't, upon realizing that God is dead and nothing matters, most people probably would not go and just immediately start like killing people and causing havoc. But as Ariel said, yes, there absolutely are psychopaths, and there's a small percent of the population that absolutely would do that. And the second thing that I wanted to say is that when you get to the other side of nihilism, as Katie or somebody was saying, and you decide to instead of taking the negative view on things, instead of saying, well, life is a blank canvas and I can make it whatever I want. And at that point, you have a choice. You can either do nothing, or you can do something terrible, or you can do something good. And most people would choose to do something good. Now, what that takes is it takes an act of faith. It takes an act of faith that you know what's good, and that what you're going to do is going to be that. And so it's not something that is objective. It's not something that can be proved to anybody. It's a conversation between you and yourself. Like, do you believe that what you are doing is good? And I'm sure that even psychopaths think that. I'm sure even people who are just totally evil, you ask them like, hey, why are you so evil? And they'd probably be like, I'm not evil. They'd probably be like, I'm just doing my thing.
One important point is I don't think psychopathy is a philosophical position. And I don't think you get to psychopathy because you go through pain and you question existence, and then you find meaning and discover things. I think it comes from a very different place, maybe from childhood trauma or something like that. But I don't think it's really related to what we're talking about here.
I think to respond directly to what you're saying, Kurt, I think it's true in psychopathy, but in sociopathy, which is more like a socially constructed condition, it actually is the result of environment. Like sociopathy comes about when people grow up in environments that are like dog eat dog, every man for himself, everyone's lying, cheating, manipulating, whatever they want to. And I would argue that when you get rid of the rules, when you get rid of moral norms, you end up with a society where everybody is sociopathic.
Yeah, and I'm
nobody here is arguing for removing moral norms. As I said, morality is intersubjective, so it's a negotiation, and we have to figure that out together.
And what I'm saying is that I'm using the label psychopath less as a technical term and more as a placeholder for, you know, those people who do evil stuff. You know, like what I'm saying is that to them, I don't think they're doing evil stuff. To them, I think they're doing whatever they think is best, right? And you know, maybe you ask even, you know, 90% of people, and maybe they agree that that person is evil. But I guarantee you that person does not think that they are evil.
And so then you have to ask, like, is there a way that you can say, yes, they are evil? Or is it just, they're evil to me, but not to them, but sort of to that guy, and a 10 out of 4 out of 10 for that guy? Is it just completely subjective, or is there some realm in which you can say, yes, it's evil regardless of what anyone thinks?
Well, clearly the number of people who think that something evil matters. I mean, just as a matter of consequence, for one. But for two, I think that, yeah, you should try to piss off the minimum number of people as possible while making the greatest number of people possible happy. But clearly there's a lot of, different standards that people might have that roughly fit that definition.
But no, I mean, morality can't really be a popularity contest, right?
I think that this is tough. I want to respond to the question that you asked. Like, I don't think that morality can be a popularity contest. If you kind of go through this existential crisis and then through the other side, I think morality becomes a little bit tricky and an interesting conversation. Because Chris, you said something like, if you get to the other side and you say, I can create life how I want to, or better, like everyone is creating the world as we want to. There's other natural forces other than humans as well, obviously, of course, but that we can create what we want to. So let's create something good. Then you get to the question, of course, what is good? Is what I think is good actually good? Am I actually benefiting people? And that question of what is good is so huge, and you can debate about it for and muse about it for just as long from this kind of a post-nihilistic perspective as from a moralistic perspective. I don't think that just because you go through this, it doesn't mean you have to throw out all ideas of like what is good and what is evil. It's just a recognition that what is good and what is bad is, I like the word that Kurt is using, intersubjective, and that kind of we're creating it and we're discovering it together, and it might shift over time, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing that we can't say is bad. It just means that, you know, the edges are a little bit fuzzy, and that's not fun to deal with. But I think it's kind of obviously true. Like, humans for all of history have not been able to agree on what is good, and maybe that's because there isn't a direct answer, and so maybe we need to accept that and then work from there.
That's what Carl Jung talks about. Like, I mean, to a certain extent, I would agree with what you guys are saying, but I would say that the intersubjectivity doesn't just include the people who happen to be alive. It includes everyone who's ever lived. And that's when you look at Carl Jung and what he talks about. Like, he looked at all human culture, basically, all human mythologies, like everything that he could get his hands on for decades and decades. And he found the underlying patterns. Like, you know, you could have like, you know, one tribe say you're supposed to sacrifice this way, another tribe you say you're supposed to sacrifice this way, and you could say like, well, clearly it's completely incompatible, and they have nothing in common because they have these different norms about sacrifice. But you can also look at a deeper level and look at the pattern that unites them. And once you do that, all these patterns start to emerge across cultures. Like, that's where you get into archetypes. And you could argue that what Jung was trying to do, he was trying to find something universal and deep within us. Something that wasn't just intersubjective, but that was at the very least biological.
This goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is that basically that decision that you make once you get to the other side of nihilism, where you're like, okay, I'm going to start doing good things. It's an act of faith that those things that you think are good are good. That's the act of faith. Okay, you basically you basically just trust that you have a conscience, right? That'll tell you which things are good and which things are bad. And I think that there's good arguments to be made that there are biological causes for. There's a biological basis for our conscience.
That's not what Jung was saying, though. Like, what Jung was saying is that there's a rational process you can take. That basically, if you agree to the premise that morality is intersubjective, then there's a rational process you can take where you look at like all of mythology and you extrapolate out the patterns, and then you figure out what actually is meaningful, what is moral to human beings. Because the argument is your individual conscience can be messed up, so you can't just follow it blindly.
I think that would be an interesting place to go from a Jim Carrey type perspective, would be to go to, okay, all right, everything is meaningless. Everything is meaningless, so I can create what I want. I want to create good. What is good? Then maybe look to Jung and and go through history and try to pull out these archetypes. But I also don't think that we can assume that the things that we've seen universally in humans are good either, because I think we also like universally see negative sides to humans, and we're trying to parse that out. And maybe like we want to move away from how things have been historically, because I think that most people would say that historically the world has been pretty unjust, and so maybe we do want to try something different and not just look to mythology and the way that humans found meaning in the past. I'm not saying discard it, but be skeptical of it also.
The meaning of the Garden of Eden is that human beings, not beings that always create good. The human being is a being that has the choice between good and evil. And when the modern person in like the post-God is dead world says, well, can we just cut out the evil part and maybe just have human beings be the being that always chooses good? And maybe we can create a society where things are just always good. And that's when you get utopianism. And that doesn't work either, as we've seen.
You're assuming that people who are going through this line of thinking would not also take that into account.
Well, what are
one thing that I want to?
I'm not trying to like assume anything or like attack. I'm just trying to like work through these things.
Yeah, and Ariel, I think one point of agreement, one point of agreement that I think most people would have with the line, or it's kind of a danger zone that you've highlighted, is that even people that are really deep into sort of a Buddhist mindfulness approach, or I think if you were to ask Jim Carrey if do you think it's preferable to take on multiple perspectives when crafting your version of meaning in the world versus just operating on your own beliefs? Most people in those camps would say, yeah, take a survey of multiple perspectives, because everybody engaged in this process has a pretty good firsthand understanding that the first person perspective is really limited. So I think when you're referencing Jung positively and saying, there's other systems that we can tap into to create the canvas, there's nothing in that statement that I would object to. That seems like, yeah, you definitely want to look at things from different points of view and then reference it as we're engaging in this creative environment. But was the core of your objection just that, a single point of view is, highly suspect failure point, or were there other components maybe that I didn't pick up on?
I think a big difference between the kind of Ubermensch perspective that I kind of perceive to be behind a lot of what Katie and Kurt are saying, and the more Jungian perspective that I'm in this moment arguing for, is it seems like with the Ubermensch perspective, the ultimate arbiter of meaning and morality, individual. Like, I'm going to create my moral system, and maybe I'll take a little bit from here, and I like some Buddhism, and I'm not so into this, versus the Jungian perspective, where it seems like you are humbling yourself to something greater, even if you call it, whether you call it human nature or whether you give it some spiritual name.
That's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense to me. Okay, so I can see it going in two ways. I wouldn't like calling my perspective an Ubermensch perspective, even if it might have a lot in common with it, kind of for that reason. I don't think that the perspective that I'm arguing for, or the perspective that Kurt is arguing for, or the perspective that Jim Carrey is taking is a perspective where I am the arbiter of morality. I think it's kind of the opposite. Maybe you do have to humble yourself to something greater. It's even humbling yourself to the idea that if you're searching for an objective truth, you're not going to find it. And like humbling yourself to the idea that we as humans may be meaningless to the universe, or that the universe is a great thing that doesn't have a set meaning either. It's a very, you could take it as the most grandiose, self-centered perspective as possible, like that this has no meaning, I can do whatever I want, I'm the best, I decide what's moral, I'm not. Or you could take it as the most humble possible perspective of, I don't know anything, nobody knows anything. You could really, it's a very extreme perspective that's hard to nail down kind of by its nature.
So I just wanted to interject that I think one of the reasons why it's really useful to talk about Jung in this context is because Jung talks about the collective conscious, which is, this grouping of very old archetypes from, that have developed over millions of years and constitute something like, the moral rules of life. These rules seem to be built into every living thing. And so like the older you go, the further you go back, the more solid of a morality you get, the more absolute of a morality you get. Ariel, you were saying that, the individual doesn't have a conscience that can really, sometimes your conscience might get it wrong. And I think that's true to a certain extent, but I think Jung would say, well, we have these deeper truths which are embedded in our biology. And those things actually are telling us things that are true. And then we have these more shallow layers of ourself, which are possibly deceiving us or telling us something, that we shouldn't follow, But yeah, the individual is the arbiter of stuff, like I thought the point of this episode was going to be like, the individual it's not so clear cut what that even is. I mean, I think there are parts of us which are very universal and there are parts of us which are very individual. And, maybe 99% of our awareness is actually, or of ourself is actually unconscious and is something that we can't access. So what I would say is that I think when you're connected to, and this is, I think, what religious people would say, when you're connected to that part of you that knows those ancient truths, then you can be sure that you're in connection with that part of you and you can be sure that it's good. It's telling you something good. So.
I agree with a lot of what you said, Chris. I think what Jung would say is, I made one criticism of like the kind of Ubermensch approach that Jung would bring up is he would say that like to become your most actualized self, you need to like make reference to the collective unconscious. And that's kind of the same as a system of archetypes that underlies all mythologies and religions. And that if you're like the conscious mind observing itself and observing its immediate environment in isolation, can easily become very pathological. And some of the dangers of this, like, kind of what I'm calling the Ubermensch perspective, which is maybe a bit specific because it seems like Jim Carrey and Katie and Kurt are not necessarily arguing for, I think it's the same ultimate kind of thing, but I think Nietzsche had a different style. Create your own destiny and it's this act of will versus you guys are a little bit more like, we're painting a work of art and we're sitting back and observing and experiencing. It's a little bit more like it's a different style. Like it's a different style.
More of a co-creation than sort of an individual who does everything.
I don't know. I think that's a whole other thing. Maybe what were we going to get into, Katie?
That's a whole other thing.